Welcome to Pastor's Chat today. As we continue to look at the introduction to the book of Philippians, today I want to talk about the great themes that we find in this book. I believe these themes will help us understand what this letter is really all about and why it continues to be such a source of encouragement to believers everywhere today. Now, the first theme that's foremost in this book, of course, is the theme of joy. And this theme of joy is connected to our minds. Our minds, what our minds are set upon. That's why over the years, as I've taught through this book, I've had a very simple outline of the book itself. In chapter 1, we find what it is to have the single mind that's set on Jesus Christ, always looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our salvation. And then also our mind on the gospel. Look how many times, and we'll talk about this, Paul mentions Jesus Christ in the first chapter and also the gospel of Jesus Christ. He lived to share that gospel. And that's what brings about great joy in our hearts. Now we find also the second thing we find in chapter 2 is the fact that we can have a submissive mind. And of course, that brings us to the second theme of the book, and that's humility. The humility of Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, yet he became poor. He who sat on the throne of God next to the Father, ruling and creating the universe, humbled himself, it says in chapter 2, and became a servant, became a man, the incarnation of Christ, and the example of Jesus in his humility, the example of Timothy in his humility, the example of Epaphroditus, the example of the Apostle Paul himself in chapter 2. If we want to experience real joy, we must have a submissive mind. And then the third chapter brings us to the next theme of the book, and that is the theme of a spiritual mind. Paul in this chapter says, though I could boast about many things, he says, I have no confidence in the flesh. No confidence in the flesh. And my friend, that's why then he goes on to say in chapter 3, this one thing I desired, that I might know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering. Now that brings me back to the thought of what Jesus talked about when he talked about joy in John chapter 15. He said, by this my Father is glorified. My Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and you will be my disciples. What brings great joy, I'm convinced, is fulfilling the purpose for which God created you. And that purpose is to glorify God. And the way you glorify God and be a disciple of Christ is bearing fruit. And the only way you bear fruit, according to John chapter 15, is to abide in Jesus Christ. Do you see how all these things all these things tie together? And when you abide in Christ, wonderful things can take place. In John chapter 16, in verse 22 through 24, Jesus said, therefore you might now have sorrow, but I will see you again, and your heart will rejoice, and your joy no one will take from you. Of course, he's talking about the fact the disciples were going to see Christ on the cross. They would have great sorrow. He knew that they would face sorrow in life. He says, and in that day you will ask me nothing. Most assuredly, I say to you, whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. Until now, you've asked nothing in my name. Ask and you will receive, that your joy might be complete. When you are fulfilling the purpose for which God created you, your joy will be full. Your joy will be complete. And that's chapter 2, the spiritual mind set on knowing Christ and the power of his resurrection. And then that brings us to chapter 4, and that is the secure mind. And there Paul says, I've learned to be content. He says, I've learned in everything, knowing how to live for Jesus Christ and have nothing, but yet have everything. And that's why he then says, I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. And my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus. My friend, that's the secure mind. These great themes, sacrificial service, unity in Christ with the other believers, humility, and of course joy that we find alone in doing the will of God every moment of our days. May God bless you today as you think about these themes as we prepare to go through the book of Philippians. God bless and have a wonderful, wonderful day.